In Blackwood Marketing's glass conference room, a brilliant strategist was about to face the humiliation that would spark Silicon Valley's most calculated revenge. What started as a client presentation took a shocking turn when she witnessed her boss stealing credit for her groundbreaking work. Alyssa Parker wasn't your typical marketing director. For 3 years, she had mastered user psychology frameworks that transformed failing campaigns into industry gold. When Richard Blackwood claimed her strategies as his own, she had no idea this betrayal would ignite her transformation into his greatest threat. What began as workplace theft would become systematic corporate warfare that dismantled everything he'd built. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The conference room's glass walls reflected the morning fog rolling across San Francisco Bay, but Alyssa Parker's attention was fixed on the presentation remote in her palm. 3 months of sleepless nights had led to this moment, the tech flow pitch that could secure Blackwood Marketing's biggest client of the year. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady despite the familiar flutter of nerves. "What I'm about to show you will fundamentally change how TechFlow approaches user acquisition." The TechFlow executives, CEO Amanda Chen, CMO Derek Santos, and their head of product, leaned forward as Alyssa clicked to her first slide. Behind her, the screen displayed a sophisticated data visualization that mapped user behavior patterns across 17 different touchpoints. Traditional marketing assumes linear customer journeys, Alyssa continued, warming to her subject. But our research shows TechFlow's users follow what I call spiral pathways. They circle back through your ecosystem multiple times before converting, each interaction building trust incrementally. She'd discovered this pattern during late-night data analysis sessions, cross-referencing user analytics with behavioral psychology studies. The insight was pure gold, a way to increase TechFlow's conversion rates by 30%, while actually reducing their acquisition costs. Amanda Chen's eyes lit up. That's exactly what we've been seeing in our user feedback but couldn't quantify. The beauty of this approach, Alyssa explained, advancing to her next slide, is that it turns your current weakness, long consideration periods, into your greatest strength. Instead of fighting the spiral, we embrace it. She was in her element now, watching the clients nod as she outlined the implementation strategy. Micro-content touchpoints, graduated value demonstrations, trust-building sequences that felt natural rather than pushy. Everything she'd learned about human psychology and digital behavior, distilled into an elegant framework. "This is brilliant," Derek Santos murmured to Amanda. "Absolutely brilliant." That's when Richard Blackwood cleared his throat. "I think what Alyssa is trying to say," Richard interrupted, rising from his seat at the head of the table, "is that we need to be more strategic about our touchpoint optimization." His smile was perfectly crafted, confident, dismissive of any complexity beyond his comprehension. Alyssa felt her stomach drop as Richard moved to stand beside the presentation screen, effectively blocking her from the client's view. "The spiral concept is interesting, of course," Richard continued, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "But what we're really talking about here is basic customer journey mapping with a few psychological principles thrown in. Nothing revolutionary." He clicked to the next slide, Alyssa's detailed implementation timeline, and began describing it as if the ideas were his own. "What I've developed here is a phased approach that leverages behavioral triggers." Alyssa watched in frozen disbelief as Richard systematically dismantled her presentation, reducing her months of research to basic concepts, while presenting her strategic framework as his own innovation. He even used her exact phrases, graduated value demonstrations, trust-building sequences, as if he'd coined them himself. "Now this," Richard said, gesturing at Alyssa's conversion funnel redesign, "this is where my experience really shows. I've been in this industry long enough to understand what actually drives results." Amanda Chen was taking notes now, completely focused on Richard. The other executives nodded along, clearly impressed by what they believed was his strategic thinking. Sarah Martinez, sitting in the corner as head of creative, kept her expression carefully neutral, but Alyssa caught her slight flinch when Richard claimed credit for the user psychology research. "Of course," Richard concluded, Implementation will require careful oversight. Alyssa here can handle the tactical details, but strategic direction needs to come from someone with real market experience. The clients exchanged glances. In the span of 20 minutes, Alyssa had been repositioned from strategic architect to mere executor of Richard's, quote, vision. Mr. Blackwood, Amanda Chen said, this approach could be exactly what we need. When can we move forward? I'll have contracts ready by tomorrow, Richard replied smoothly. Alyssa, why don't you walk our friends through the timeline details while I step out for a quick call? He patted Alyssa's shoulder with condescending familiarity. She's very thorough with the operational aspects. The meeting concluded with handshakes and promises of partnership. The TechFlow executives left energized, believing they'd just witnessed Richard Blackwood's strategic genius. Alyssa managed professional smiles and confirmations about implementation timelines, but inside, she felt something fundamental breaking. As the conference room emptied, Richard lingered, ostensibly organizing his papers. When they were alone, his mask slipped completely. You did good work on the research, he said casually, not bothering to look at her. Very thorough. But you have to understand, Alyssa, clients need to hear strategy from someone with real authority, someone they trust to deliver results. Alyssa found her voice. Those were my ideas, Richard. My research, my framework, my strategy. Richard looked up then, his expression almost pitying. Were they? Because from where I sit, that looked like basic customer journey optimization, with some academic theory layered on top. Nothing I couldn't have developed myself, given the time. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. Here's something you need to understand about this business, Alyssa. Ideas are cheap. Anyone can have ideas. What matters is execution, relationships, the ability to sell vision to clients who want to believe they're working with the best. His smile was cold now, all pretense of mentorship abandoned. You'll never succeed without guidance, without connections, without someone who understands how this industry really works. He paused, letting the words sink in. You'll never succeed without me. Something crystallized in that moment, not just anger at the theft of her work, but clarity about what Richard truly was. Not a leader or mentor, but a parasite who had built his success by consuming other people's talents. You're right, Alyssa said quietly. I won't succeed working for you. She walked to her desk, Richard's voice following her. Alyssa, don't be dramatic. You're emotional right now. But she was already pulling files from her drawers, her personal items from the shelves. Sarah Martinez appeared in her peripheral vision, concern creasing her features, but Alyssa barely registered the questioning looks from her colleagues. The cardboard box felt heavier than it should have as she walked toward the elevator, carrying 3 years of her professional life. Behind her, the office buzzed with whispered speculation. Richard called out one final time. Think about what you're giving up, Alyssa. You'll regret this. The elevator doors closed on his words, but not on the determination that had taken root in Alyssa's chest. He was wrong about one thing. She wouldn't regret this decision. She would make him regret underestimating her. Marcus's hand extended toward Alyssa across the small cafe table, business card pinched between his fingers. The Bay Area Tech Entrepreneurs Meetup buzzed around them, but his attention was completely focused on the woman who just articulated a market insight that had escaped most seasoned professionals. That comment you made about user psychology during the panel, Marcus said, settling back into his chair. Most people see conversion optimization as a numbers game. You see it as human behavior. Alyssa accepted the card, noting the elegant simplicity. Marcus Thompson, strategic advisor. 3 weeks since walking out of Blackwood, and this was the first time someone had looked at her like she had something valuable to offer rather than something to prove. I've been working from my apartment, she admitted, surprised by her own honesty, trying to figure out what comes next. Marcus's knowing smile suggested he'd been exactly where she was. Let me guess. Alternating between absolute certainty that you made the right choice and complete terror that you've destroyed your career. The accuracy of his assessment made her laugh despite herself. How did you know? Because I sat in a cramped studio in Chicago 15 years ago, wondering if I was brave or just stupid for walking away from a steady paycheck. Marcus signaled the waitress for another coffee. Want to tell me what really happened at Blackwood? Something about his calm presence broke down her carefully maintained professional composure. The story poured out. Richard's systematic credit theft, the tech flow presentation, the humiliating dismissal of her work as quote, basic concepts. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. So now you want revenge, he said when she finished. Alyssa started to deny it, then stopped. Yes, I want him to face consequences for what he's done. Not just to me, to everyone whose work he's stolen. Marcus leaned forward. I built 2 agencies from nothing, sold them both. Made more money than I knew what to do with. But you know what I'm proudest of? The companies my former employees went on to start. The leaders they became when someone finally believed in them. He paused, studying her face. Revenge is about the past, Alyssa. Building something better is about the future. Which one are you really interested in? The question hit harder than she'd expected. She'd spent 3 weeks obsessing over Richard's theft, imagining scenarios where his incompetence would be exposed. But Marcus was asking her to think bigger. What if, Marcus continued, instead of destroying Richard's business, you built something so much better that his best people chose to leave? What if you created the kind of workplace you always wanted to work for? Across town, Richard was indeed celebrating. The TechFlow contract sat signed on his desk, and he'd already scheduled a company-wide meeting to announce the victory. In his version of events, he'd personally developed the innovative strategy that had won over the client. Strategic thinking, he told Tom Bradley, who nodded enthusiastically from the guest chair. That's what separates real leaders from tactical thinkers like Alyssa. But even as he basked in his stolen success, Richard couldn't shake a nagging anxiety. Alyssa's abrupt departure had created gaps he hadn't anticipated. Her client management skills, her analytical insights, her ability to translate complex strategies into actionable plans, he was discovering how much he'd relied on her contributions. Back at the cafe, Marcus was sketching something on a napkin. Here's what I learned about revenge in business, he said, drawing 2 parallel lines. You can spend your energy tearing down someone else's foundation, or you can build your own so high that their foundation becomes irrelevant. Alyssa studied the simple diagram, seeing the profound truth in its simplicity. You're talking about competing on a completely different level. I'm talking about creating something so compelling that talent gravitates toward you naturally. Marcus capped his pen. Richard succeeded by taking credit for other people's work. What happens when those people have somewhere better to go? The idea crystallized with startling clarity. Not revenge. Revolution. Not destruction. Construction of something fundamentally better. I want to do this, Alyssa said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. I want to build something real. Marcus smiled. Then let's talk about what real looks like. The notification chimed on Alyssa's laptop at 2:47 a.m., pulling her from the financial projections spreadsheet that had consumed her evening. BioNova's preliminary campaign metrics glowed on the screen. Click-through rates up 43%, cost per acquisition down 31%. Her first client was actually succeeding. She leaned back in her desk chair, surveying her makeshift office. The Murphy bed folded against the wall, desk positioned to catch morning light from the single window, overlooking a narrow San Francisco alley. Not exactly the prestigious corner office she'd imagined when she first moved to the city, but it was entirely hers. The apartment's front door rattled with familiar determination, 3 quick knocks followed by 2 slower ones. Jessica's signature pattern from their childhood in Ohio. Don't tell me you're working at 3 a.m, Jessica called through the door. Alyssa opened it to find her sister standing in the hallway, overnight bag slung over her shoulder, expression mixing concern with exasperation. Surprise visit? Alyssa asked, though Jessica's worry-creased forehead suggested this trip had been planned. Mom called. Said you've been distant during your weekly check-ins. Jessica pushed past her into the apartment, immediately assessing the lived-in workspace. She's worried you're not eating properly. The truth was more complicated. Their weekly calls had become exercises in careful omission. Alyssa downplaying the financial stress, the isolation, the moments of crushing self-doubt that hit at unexpected times. I'm fine, Jess. Actually, I just got confirmation that my first client's campaign is performing ahead of projections. Jessica examined the apartment more closely, the stack of ramen containers beside the sink, the professional clothes hanging on a makeshift rod, the absence of any personal touches beyond family photos. This isn't fine, Lise. This is survival mode. They'd had this conversation before, in different forms. Jessica had chosen the safe path: accounting degree, steady job with benefits, predictable advancement. She'd watched Alyssa chase opportunities in San Francisco with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. Remember when we used to build those elaborate blanket forts? Jessica settled onto the small couch. You always insisted on making them bigger, more complex. I was happy with 4 chairs and a sheet. Alyssa joined her, recognizing the opening to a deeper conversation. You thought I was showing off. I thought you were going to bring the whole thing crashing down. Jessica's smile was gentle but pointed. Sometimes I still think that. They talked until dawn, Jessica's practical concerns colliding with Alyssa's ambitious vision. The conversation covered familiar territory: financial security versus professional fulfillment, family expectations versus personal dreams, but with new urgency given Alyssa's current circumstances. I'm not asking you to be safe, Jessica said as morning light began filtering through the window. I'm asking you to be smart, to have a backup plan. Alyssa's phone buzzed with a social media notification. Richard Blackwood had been featured in Marketing Weekly's Industry Leaders to Watch list, photographed in his corner office, discussing his innovative approach to user psychology in digital marketing. The article quoted him extensively about strategies that sounded remarkably familiar: graduated value demonstrations, spiral pathway optimization, trust-building sequences. Her words, her concepts, presented as his groundbreaking insights. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jessica noticed her expression change. What is it? Alyssa showed her the article, explaining the stolen credit with barely controlled frustration. Jessica read it twice, her accountant's mind processing the implications. He's not just stealing credit, Jessica said slowly. He's building his entire reputation on your work. What happens when he needs to innovate again? The question crystallized something Alyssa had been sensing but hadn't articulated. Richard's success was fundamentally unsustainable because it wasn't built on genuine capability. He'll fail, Alyssa realized. Without people to steal from, he'll eventually be exposed. So the question is, Jessica said, do you wait for him to fail naturally, or do you speed up the process? Her laptop chimed again. Another BioNova update. Their CEO wanted to discuss expanding the campaign scope, potentially doubling the contract value. Real success, built on real work, sustainable because it was authentic. I think, Alyssa said, watching Richard's smug photograph fade as she closed the browser. I'm going to build something so much better that his failure becomes inevitable. Jessica smiled. Now that sounds like my sister. The hotel bar at the Bay Area Digital Marketing Summit hummed with networking conversations. But Sarah Martinez sat alone, nursing a whiskey and staring at her phone. The day's sessions had been exhausting, not because of the content, but because of the constant reminders of how far behind Blackwood was falling. Sarah? She looked up to find Alyssa Parker approaching, looking polished and confident in a way that seemed impossible given their last encounter 3 months ago. Alyssa. Sarah's voice carried genuine surprise. I heard you were taking some time off. Taking time to start my own agency, actually. Alyssa gestured to the empty chair. Mind if I join you? The conversation started carefully, professionally distant. But the whiskey and Sarah's growing frustration with her current situation gradually lowered her defenses. How's Blackwood? Alyssa asked. Sarah's laugh held no humor. Remember how Richard was after you left? Paranoid, controlling, taking credit for everything. Well, that's become his permanent state. She described the deteriorating conditions. Richard's increasing micromanagement, his habit of presenting other people's ideas as his own, the way talented employees were beginning to quietly explore other options. David Kim has been getting calls from recruiters every week, Sarah confided. Jennifer's been working late constantly because Richard keeps changing client strategies at the last minute, then blaming her when results don't meet his impossible expectations. Alyssa listened, processing not just the information but the deeper implications. Richard's leadership style wasn't just toxic, it was systematically destroying the foundation of his own business. "What about you?" Alyssa asked. "Still happy and creative?" Sarah's expression darkened. "Last week, I presented a campaign concept I'd been developing for months." Richard listened to the pitch, then announced he'd present it to the client himself, because strategic vision needs to come from leadership. The familiar pattern of credit theft continuing and escalating in Alyssa's absence. The client loved it, of course. "Richard's already planning to use my concept as a case study for his speaking engagements." Sarah finished her whiskey. "I've been at Blackwood for 4 years. I've watched him take credit for dozens of campaigns, including several that won industry awards." Alyssa recognized the breaking point she'd experienced months earlier, the moment when accommodation becomes impossible. "What would it take," Alyssa asked carefully, "for you to consider a change?" Sarah's eyes sharpened. "Are you recruiting me? I'm asking what would make you happy professionally. What would make you excited to go to work again?" The question seemed to catch Sarah off guard. She considered it seriously, her creative mind engaging with possibilities rather than problems. "Autonomy," she said finally. "The ability to develop campaigns from concept to execution without someone stealing credit. Leadership that actually understands creative work instead of just commoditizing it." Alyssa nodded. "What else?" "Growth opportunities. I've been ready for a senior creative director role for 2 years, but Richard keeps promising promotions that never materialize." Sarah's voice gained energy as she articulated her professional desires. "I want to build a team, mentor junior talent, create work that actually makes a difference." They talked for another hour, Sarah describing her vision for ethical, innovative marketing while Alyssa listened and occasionally probed deeper. By the end of the conversation, something had shifted. "You're building something different, aren't you?" Sarah asked. "I'm trying to build the kind of agency we both wish we could work for," Alyssa replied. "The question is whether that's something you'd be interested in being part of." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering implications and possibilities. "I have responsibilities," she said finally. "Financial obligations. I can't just jump ship without knowing where I'm landing." "I wouldn't ask you to, but I'd ask you to keep an open mind about what's possible." As they parted ways, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope, not just for escape from her current situation, but for genuine professional fulfillment. Meanwhile, 2 floors up in his suite, Richard was on a conference call with potential investors, pitching Blackwood's innovative leadership in behavioral marketing. He used phrases that had become familiar: spiral pathway optimization, graduated value demonstrations, without irony or acknowledgement. But even as he projected confidence, Richard was struggling with a growing problem. Without Alyssa's analytical insights and strategic thinking, his presentations were becoming repetitive. He was running out of other people's ideas to steal. The foundation was beginning to crack. Marcus's conference room overlooked the San Francisco Bay, but Alyssa's attention was focused on the whiteboard, covered with organizational charts, financial projections, and recruitment timelines. 3 months of planning had led to this moment, the formal launch of Operation Talent Liberation. "David Kim," Alyssa said, pointing to the first name on her target list. MIT graduate, data science genius, completely undervalued at Blackwood. Richard's been promising him a promotion for 8 months. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying the detailed profiles Alyssa had developed for each recruitment target. What's his primary motivation? Intellectual respect. He wants to work on challenging problems with people who understand his contributions. Alyssa moved to the next profile. Sarah Martinez, creative director trapped in a tactical role. She wants autonomy and the chance to build something meaningful. The research had taken weeks, combining LinkedIn intelligence with casual industry networking and insights from former Blackwood employees. Each target represented not just a talented individual, but a strategic asset that would cripple Richard's operations. Jennifer Walsh is the crown jewel, Alyssa continued. Account director, with relationships to Blackwood's 5 biggest clients. If she leaves, she could potentially bring 2 or 3 of those relationships with her. Marcus nodded approvingly. You've thought about the ethics of this? It was a question they discussed extensively. The line between competitive recruitment and predatory poaching was important to both of them. We're not stealing employees, Alyssa said firmly. We're offering better opportunities to people who are already considering changes. Every conversation I've had suggests these people are actively unhappy with their current situation. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. TechFlow had just announced disappointing user acquisition numbers, 3 months after implementing Richard's, quotes, innovative spiral pathway strategy. The irony wasn't lost on her. Without proper implementation oversight, even her own strategic framework was failing under Richard's mismanagement. He's making our case for us, Marcus observed, reading over her shoulder. Richard's incompetence is becoming harder to hide. Alyssa pulled up another document, financial projections for Parker Strategic's expansion. Her success with BioNova had led to 3 additional clients, generating enough revenue to make competitive salary offers credible. We can afford to double David's salary, she said. Sarah's too. The question is whether they'll take the risk. Marcus stood, walking to the window. 15 years ago I thought business success was about crushing the competition. Took me too long to realize it's actually about building something so compelling that competition becomes irrelevant. What changed your mind? I hired a brilliant young strategist who'd been working for a toxic boss, watched her flourish when someone finally gave her room to grow. Marcus smiled. Best business decision I ever made was focusing on what people needed rather than what competitors deserved. Alyssa felt the shift in perspective, from revenge-focused to growth-focused. The plan remained the same, but the motivation had evolved. Her laptop chimed with an email from David Kim, responding to her request for a, quote, casual coffee conversation about industry trends. His willingness to meet suggested he was more open to change than his LinkedIn profile indicated. Tom Bradley's been asking questions, Alyssa noted, reviewing her intelligence network. Richard's lieutenant is getting suspicious about employee loyalty. Good, Marcus said. Paranoia makes people make mistakes, and Richard's already prone to poor decisions under pressure. They spent the next hour refining approach strategies for each target. David would respond to data-driven arguments about career trajectory and intellectual challenge. Sarah needed reassurance about creative autonomy and leadership opportunities. Jennifer would require careful handling around client relationships and ethical considerations. The timeline is aggressive, Marcus warned. 4 major recruitments in 6 weeks. If any of them go badly, it could damage your reputation in the industry. Alyssa considered the risk. What's the alternative? Watch Richard continue to build his success on stolen work while talented people waste their potential in a toxic environment? No alternative, Marcus agreed. Just wanted to make sure you understood the stakes. As the meeting concluded, Alyssa felt the familiar mixture of anxiety and determination that had driven her since leaving Blackwood. But now it was tempered by clarity of purpose and confidence in her approach. Richard Blackwood had built his empire by exploiting other people's talents. She was about to show him what happened when those people had somewhere better to go. The game was about to begin. David Kim's fingers hovered over his laptop keyboard, the resignation letter cursor blinking in the empty document. The data science meetup at TechCrunch Disrupt had ended an hour ago, but his conversation with Alyssa Parker still echoed in his mind. You developed the algorithmic framework that increased Blackwood's client retention by 47%, she'd said, sliding a printout across the cafe table. But Richard presented it as his own innovation at the Marketing Analytics Conference. The evidence was undeniable. Screenshots of his internal reports, time-stamped emails, even video footage of Richard's presentation where he claimed credit for, quote, developing breakthrough retention algorithms. David had watched his 2 years of work reduced to a footnote while Richard basked in industry recognition. The question isn't whether you're being exploited, Alyssa had continued. The question is what you're going to do about it. Now sitting in his cramped studio apartment, David wrestled with a decision that felt monumentally larger than just changing jobs. Alyssa's offer wasn't just about salary, though doubling his income would finally let him move out of this overpriced shoebox. It was about intellectual respect, creative freedom, and the chance to build something meaningful. His phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Need the Q3 analytics review first thing Monday. Client presentation Tuesday. Another weekend sacrificed to work that Richard would present as his own strategic insight. David had watched this pattern repeat dozens of times, each instance chipping away at his professional self-worth. The resignation letter took shape slowly, each word carefully chosen. After careful consideration, I have decided to pursue new opportunities that align better with my professional growth objectives. My last day will be 2 weeks from today. Professional. Diplomatic. Revealing nothing about his true motivations or destination. At Blackwood, Richard was working late in his corner office, preparing for Monday's board meeting. The quarterly reports looked strong on the surface, but he was increasingly aware of gaps in his analytical capabilities. David's insights had become essential to his presentations, and lately, the data scientist had seemed distracted, less forthcoming with the detailed explanations Richard relied on. Tom Bradley knocked on the office door, his expression carrying the eager anticipation of someone with gossip to share. David Kim's been getting a lot of calls lately, Tom reported. Saw him taking one during lunch break today. Looked pretty serious. Richard felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Employee defection was his greatest fear, not just for the operational disruption, but for what departing employees might reveal about his leadership methods. Keep monitoring the situation, Richard instructed. Let me know if you hear anything specific. Monday morning arrived with David's resignation email in Richard's inbox, the subject line hitting like a physical blow. Notice of resignation, David Kim. Richard immediately called him into his office, deploying every retention tactic he'd used before: promises of promotion, salary increases, flexible working arrangements. But David's responses felt rehearsed, professional, but distant. I appreciate everything Blackwood has done for my development, David said, his tone suggesting the opposite. But I've decided it's time for a new challenge. Where are you going? Richard demanded, abandoning diplomatic pretense. I'd prefer not to discuss my future plans until I've completed my transition responsibilities here. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, Richard growing increasingly desperate as he realized David was beyond persuasion. When his star analyst finally left the office, Richard felt the first real tremor of panic. Within hours, word of David's resignation had spread through the office. Sarah Martinez watched the subsequent scramble with interest, noting how quickly Richard's confidence crumbled when faced with losing someone genuinely indispensable. That evening, David called Alyssa to confirm his acceptance of her offer. Welcome to Parker Strategic, she said, and David could hear the satisfaction in her voice. Thank you for seeing my potential, he replied. I'm looking forward to building something real. As David packed his personal items that night, he felt lighter than he had in months. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter, one where his contributions would be valued rather than stolen, where his growth would be nurtured rather than exploited. Richard's empire had lost its first critical support beam. Sarah Martinez stared at the email on her screen, reading Alyssa's formal offer for the third time. Creative Director, Parker Strategic. Full autonomy over campaign development. Salary that made her current compensation look insulting. Equity stake that could actually build long-term wealth. But it was the final paragraph that made her decision. You'll have the resources and freedom to build the creative department you've always envisioned, with junior talent you can mentor, and campaigns that make a real difference. The opportunity she'd been waiting for, articulated perfectly. 3 days had passed since David Kim's shocking departure, and the Blackwood office felt like a ship taking on water. Richard's panic was barely concealed behind increasingly erratic decision-making. He'd already promoted Tom Bradley to interim analytical director, a laughable appointment that highlighted how little Richard understood about data science. Sarah's resignation email was briefer than David's, but its impact was seismic. As head of creative, she controlled relationships with freelancers, understood client preferences, and had institutional knowledge spanning 4 years. Her departure would leave massive operational gaps. Richard's reaction was predictably dramatic. He stormed into the creative department, demanding explanations, making accusations about competitor recruitment tactics. His paranoia was becoming obvious to everyone, creating exactly the toxic atmosphere that drove talented people away. "This is corporate espionage," Richard declared during an emergency staff meeting. "Someone is systematically targeting our best people." Jennifer Walsh exchanged glances with Alex Rodriguez across the conference table. Both had noticed the pattern. First, Alyssa's dramatic exit. Then David's sudden departure. Now Sarah's resignation. It wasn't coincidence. "Maybe people are just recognizing they have better options," Alex said quietly, then immediately regretted speaking as Richard's attention focused on him like a laser. "Better options?" Richard's voice carried dangerous edge. "What better options?" The meeting devolved into an uncomfortable interrogation, with Richard demanding loyalty pledges and threatening legal action against anyone sharing proprietary information. By the time it ended, half the staff looked ready to update their resumes. That afternoon, Alyssa called Alex directly. "I've been following your work," she said without preamble. "Your social media campaign concepts for the Martinez Electronics account were brilliant, simple but sophisticated." Alex felt a familiar frustration. Richard had taken credit for that campaign, using it as a case study in his recent speaking engagements. "Thank you," Alex replied carefully, aware that office phones might be monitored. "I'm building something different," Alyssa continued. "A place where young talent can actually grow, where ideas are credited to their creators, where mentorship means more than exploitation." The conversation lasted 30 minutes, Alyssa painting a picture of professional development that sounded impossible after months under Richard's leadership. Real training programs, creative freedom, advancement based on merit rather than politics. "I know it's a risk," Alyssa acknowledged. "You're early in your career, and jumping to a startup requires courage. But I'm offering you the chance to help build something from the ground up, to have real impact rather than just execute other people's visions." Alex's decision crystallized with startling clarity. "When would you need an answer?" "Take a week to think about it." "But Alex, don't let fear of the unknown keep you trapped in a situation that's crushing your potential." By Thursday, 3 resignations in 1 week had created chaos at Blackwood. Client campaigns were delayed, presentations were being reassigned, and the remaining staff was drowning in additional responsibilities. Jennifer Walsh found herself managing accounts that required creative input she couldn't provide, analytical insights she didn't possess, and strategic thinking that had walked out the door with Alyssa months earlier. "This can't continue," she confided to her assistant. "We're going to start losing clients if we can't deliver consistent service." Richard's response was to work everyone harder, demanding longer hours and impossible timelines. His leadership style, always authoritarian, became openly hostile as pressure mounted. Friday afternoon brought Alex's resignation email, the 4th departure in 10 days. Richard's mask finally slipped completely during his confrontation with the young strategist. "You're making a career-ending mistake," Richard snarled. "I'll make sure every agency in the Bay Area knows about your disloyalty." Alex stood his ground, surprising himself with his own calm. "I'm not being disloyal, Richard. I'm being honest about what I need professionally." As Alex cleaned out his desk, Jennifer Walsh watched from her office, processing the implications. 4 talented people had found better opportunities elsewhere. The pattern wasn't coincidental. It was systematic. Someone was offering Blackwood's best employees exactly what they needed to thrive. The question was whether she would be next. Jennifer Walsh's hands trembled slightly as she reviewed the client retention reports spread across her dining table. 3 major accounts had expressed concerns about service consistency. 2 had requested meetings to, quote, discuss their ongoing needs. In agency speak, that meant they were preparing to fire Blackwood. Her phone buzzed with another late-night email from Richard, demanding revised proposals for the Henderson Group account. The 4th revision this week, each one contradicting the previous version's strategic direction. Without David's analytical insights or Sarah's creative vision, Richard was flailing, making decisions based on panic rather than expertise. The doorbell interrupted her work at 8 p.m., an unusual time for visitors in her quiet Berkeley neighborhood. Through the peephole, she saw Alyssa Parker standing on her front porch, professional but relaxed in dark jeans and a blazer. I hope you don't mind me stopping by, Alyssa said when Jennifer opened the door. I know it's late, but I wanted to have a conversation away from office politics. Jennifer gestured her inside, noting how Alyssa's presence immediately changed the energy in her living room. Confident but not aggressive, purposeful but not pushy. You've been busy, Jennifer observed, settling into her armchair. David, Sarah, Alex, that's quite a recruitment streak. I prefer to think of it as offering opportunities to people ready for change. Alyssa's smile was knowing. The question is whether you're ready for change too. They talked for 2 hours, Jennifer gradually revealing her growing frustration with Blackwood's deteriorating culture. Richard's paranoia had reached toxic levels. Client relationships she'd spent years building were being damaged by his erratic strategic changes. Her reputation in the industry was beginning to suffer by association. I've seen this pattern before, Alyssa said. Toxic leadership creates a downward spiral that eventually destroys everything it touches. The only question is whether you want to go down with the ship or find a lifeboat. Jennifer's ethical concerns ran deeper than professional frustration. She'd watched Richard steal credit from talented employees for years, telling herself it was just corporate politics. But his treatment of David, Sarah, and Alex had crossed lines she couldn't ignore anymore. What about my clients? Jennifer asked. I have relationships that took years to build. I can't just abandon them. Who says you'd be abandoning them? Alyssa leaned forward. What if you could offer them better service, more innovative strategies, more consistent execution? What if leaving Blackwood was actually the best thing you could do for your clients? The conversation shifted to specifics: Parker Strategic's client service philosophy, growth projections, and Jennifer's potential role as head of client relations. More importantly, they discussed values, transparency in client communications, ethical marketing practices, authentic collaboration rather than authoritarian control. I won't recruit your clients, Alyssa promised, but if they choose to work with Parker Strategic because we offer better service, that's their decision to make. Monday brought crisis to Blackwood. The Henderson Group had fired them over the weekend, citing inconsistent strategic direction and deteriorating service quality. Richard's response was to blame Jennifer for failing to manage the relationship properly. Your job is client retention, he shouted during their confrontation. How did you let this happen? Jennifer's years of diplomatic professionalism finally cracked. Maybe it happened because you've changed their strategy 4 times in 2 weeks without consulting anyone who actually understands their business. Richard's face flushed red. Don't blame me for your failure to execute. Execute what? Your constant contradictions? Your strategic changes that ignore market research and consumer psychology? Jennifer's voice rose to match his. You're destroying this company through sheer incompetence. The argument escalated until half the office was watching through glass walls, witnessing Richard's complete loss of professional composure. His threats about Jennifer's future in the industry only reinforced her decision. That afternoon, she submitted her resignation and immediately called her 3 most loyal clients. I want to be transparent about my situation, she told each one. I'm leaving Blackwood to join a smaller agency that I believe can serve you better. I'm not asking you to follow me, but I wanted you to hear this directly rather than through office rumors. 2 of the 3 requested meetings to discuss their options. By Wednesday, Jennifer Walsh had officially joined Parker Strategic, bringing with her not just years of experience and industry relationships, but validation that Alyssa's vision was attracting the best talent in the market. Richard's empire had lost its foundation. What remained was about to collapse. The Parker strategic offices hummed with productive energy as Jennifer Walsh conducted her first client strategy meeting. David Kim analyzed market trends on multiple monitors, and Sarah Martinez reviewed creative concepts with Alex Rodriguez. 6 months of careful planning had created something remarkable, a workplace where talent flourished rather than withered. Alyssa was reviewing quarterly projections when the receptionist's nervous voice crackled through the intercom. "Ms. Parker? There's a Richard Blackwood here to see you. He seems upset." Through the glass partition, she could see him in the lobby, disheveled, agitated, his usually perfect appearance showing cracks. His arrival had been inevitable. Blackwood Marketing was hemorrhaging clients, and desperation made people unpredictable. "Send him to conference room B," Alyssa replied calmly, "and ask the team to stay at their desks for a few minutes." Richard stormed into the conference room like a man barely containing explosive rage. His eyes swept the visible workspace, taking in his former employees, thriving in their new environment, and his expression darkened further. "You think you're clever?" he began without preamble. "Systematically destroying my business through corporate espionage." Alyssa remained seated, her voice steady. "I think I'm offering talented people opportunities they deserve. If that threatens your business model, perhaps the problem isn't with my recruiting. Don't play innocent." Richard slammed his briefcase onto the table. "You've stolen my entire team, violated non-compete agreements, and engaged in predatory business practices." "Actually," Alyssa opened a folder, "let's discuss predatory business practices. Like taking credit for my tech flow strategy, or presenting David's retention algorithms as your own innovation, or claiming Sarah's creative campaigns for your award submissions." She slid documents across the table, timestamps, emails, video evidence of Richard's systematic credit theft spanning 3 years. His face went pale as he recognized the scope of documentation. "This proves nothing," he blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. "It proves everything." Alyssa's tone remained calm, professional. "It proves you built your reputation by stealing other people's work. It proves you're fundamentally incapable of generating original strategic thinking. It proves your success was a house of cards waiting to collapse." Through the glass walls, Richard could see his former employees watching the confrontation. David looked up from his computers, offering a small nod of acknowledgement. Sarah paused her creative review to observe the man who'd stolen years of her work. Alex stopped mid-conversation, his expression mixing curiosity with satisfaction. "They were nothing without my guidance," Richard said desperately. "I developed their talents, gave them opportunities." "You exploited their talents," Jennifer Walsh interrupted, entering the conference room. "You created a toxic environment that crushed creativity and rewarded sycophancy over competence." Richard whirled to face her. "Jennifer, you're making a career-ending mistake. My connections in this industry. Your connections won't save you from what's coming," Jennifer replied coolly. 3 clients have already called Parker strategic requesting proposals. The Henderson Group specifically asked for campaigns that demonstrate quote, authentic strategic thinking rather than recycled concepts. The color drained from Richard's face as the implications sank in. His business model, stealing credit from talented employees, had finally met its natural consequence. Without people to exploit, his incompetence was exposed. "You'll never succeed," he said, his voice rising with panic. "None of you understand how this industry really works. You need connections, relationships, the ability to sell vision to clients who want to work with established leaders." Alyssa stood slowly, her presence filling the room with quiet authority. "You're right about one thing, Richard. This industry is about relationships. But you never understood that relationships are built on trust, competence, and delivering real value. You built yours on lies, theft, and exploitation." She moved to the door, holding it open. "Your business is failing because you never learned to lead, only to steal." Your reputation is crumbling because it was never authentic. And your employees left because they finally found somewhere that valued their actual contributions. Richard's final gambit was pure desperation. I'll sue you for corporate espionage. I'll destroy your reputation in this industry. With what evidence? Alyssa smiled. That I offered better opportunities to unhappy employees? That I created a workplace based on respect rather than exploitation? That I built something authentic while you built something hollow? As Richard gathered his briefcase, his movements jerky with barely controlled rage, the Parker strategic team continued their work. No drama, no celebration, just professional people focused on building something meaningful. This isn't over, Richard muttered as he reached the door. You're right, Alyssa replied. It's just beginning. After he left, the office remained quiet for several minutes, processing the confrontation's significance. David was the first to speak. He looked smaller than I remembered. Sarah nodded. Angry people always do when they can't intimidate anyone anymore. Alyssa returned to her desk, her quarterly projections still open on her laptop. Parker Strategic was thriving, not because she'd destroyed Richard's business, but because she'd built something better. Richard's downfall was complete, but it felt less like victory than vindication of a simple truth. Authentic leadership would always triumph over authoritarian control. The revolution was over. The real work was just beginning. 6 months after Richard's humiliating confrontation, Alyssa stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of Parker Strategic's new offices in Soma, watching fog roll across San Francisco Bay. The space buzzed with creative energy. Sarah's team collaborating on a breakthrough campaign for a sustainable tech startup. David's analysts diving deep into consumer behavior patterns. Jennifer managing client relationships that had grown into genuine partnerships. The morning's celebration had been understated but meaningful. Technova, the Fortune 500 company that had just signed as their anchor client, represented validation beyond anything Alyssa had imagined when she first walked out of Blackwood's conference room. Remember when we used to meet in that tiny cafe near the Embarcadero? Marcus Thompson settled into the chair across from her desk, his smile carrying the satisfaction of a mentor, watching his protégé exceed expectations. I remember you asking whether I wanted revenge or real success, Alyssa replied. I thought they were the same thing. Marcus chuckled. Most people do. Initially. What changed your mind? Alyssa gestured toward the workspace visible through her office's glass walls. Alex Rodriguez was presenting campaign concepts to a client via video conference, his confidence and expertise evident in every gesture. 6 months ago, he'd been fetching coffee and watching his ideas get stolen. Now he was leading strategic initiatives that would shape brand futures. Watching them flourish, she said simply, realizing that destroying Richard's business was just a side effect of building something better. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Saw the TechCrunch article about Parker Strategic. Mom's framing it for the fridge. So proud of you. The article had been gratifying. Rising star agency redefines workplace culture and competitive marketing landscape. But what mattered more was the substance behind the headlines. Employee satisfaction scores in the 95th percentile. Client retention rates exceeding industry standards. Growth that was sustainable because it was built on genuine capability rather than stolen credit. David Kim knocked on her office door, laptop under his arm. Have a minute to review the Q4 analytics? I think you'll like what we're seeing. The numbers were remarkable. Not just revenue growth, but metrics that measured real impact. Client campaign performance consistently exceeded benchmarks. Employee professional development was tracking ahead of projections. Even their pro bono work with local nonprofits was generating industry recognition. We're getting recruitment inquiries from agencies across the country, David reported. People want to understand how we're achieving these results. Alyssa smiled at the irony. A year ago, she'd been desperate to prove herself capable of success. Now, other agencies were trying to reverse engineer her approach. It's not complicated, she told David. We just treat people like human beings instead of resources to exploit. Jennifer Walsh appeared in the doorway, her expression mixing excitement with concern. I just got off the phone with a potential new client. Tech startup with incredible potential. But they're currently working with Blackwood Marketing. The name still carried emotional weight, though less than before. Through industry connections, Alyssa had heard fragments of Richard's trajectory. Client losses mounting, key personnel departures continuing, his reputation steadily eroding as former employees shared their experiences. "What did you tell them?" Alyssa asked. "That we'd be happy to meet with them, but they should honor their current commitments until those contracts naturally expire." Jennifer's approach reflected the ethical standards that had become Parker Strategic's foundation. Professional integrity matters more than immediate business. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Sarah Martinez announced that a young woman named Priya Chen was in the lobby, asking to speak with Alyssa about workplace toxicity and career transitions. Priya looked familiar, mid-20s, professionally dressed, but carrying the slight tension of someone under professional stress. When she introduced herself as a junior strategist at Morrison & Associates, Alyssa recognized the signs immediately. "My boss takes credit for everything I do," Priya said during their conversation, "presents my research as his insights, claims my campaign concept as his innovations. I've been told this is just how the industry works, but watching your team's success made me wonder if there's another way." Listening to Priya's story, Alyssa felt the familiar anger at workplace exploitation, tempered now by experience and perspective. The cycle continued, talented people trapped in toxic environments, convinced they had no alternatives. "There's always another way," Alyssa replied. "The question is whether you're ready to build it." They talked for an hour, Alyssa sharing lessons learned about professional transitions, ethical leadership, and the difference between short-term career moves and long-term strategic thinking. She offered guidance, connections, and, most importantly, proof that toxic workplace cultures weren't inevitable. As Priya left, energized and armed with actionable advice, Alyssa realized this was what success actually meant. Not the satisfaction of Richard's downfall, but the opportunity to help others avoid similar exploitation. Not the victory of competition, but the impact of creating something genuinely better. Evening brought quiet reflection as the office emptied. Through her windows, she watched the city lights emerge in the gathering darkness, each one representing dreams, ambitions, and the possibility of authentic achievement. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Blackwood Marketing closes doors after client exodus. The article was brief, clinical in its assessment of strategic failures and leadership challenges. She felt no satisfaction in Richard's ultimate failure, only sadness for the waste of human potential his toxicity had caused. His story was a cautionary tale about the inevitable consequences of building success on others' contributions, rather than authentic capability. Parker Strategic thrived, not because she'd destroyed a competitor, but because she'd created something worth building. That distinction made all the difference. Real success, she'd learned, wasn't about defeating others. It was about creating space for everyone to flourish. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.